Chapter 3, Part 2 of Principia Ethica. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. Principia Ethica by G. E. Moore. 43. But now let us return to consider another of Mill's arguments for his position that happiness is the sole end of human action. Mill admits, as I have said, that pleasure is not the only thing we actually desire. The desire of virtue, he says, is not as universal, but is as authentic a fact as the desire of happiness. And again, money is, in many cases, desired in and for itself. These admissions are, of course, in naked and glaring contradiction with his argument that pleasure is the only thing desirable, because it is the only thing desired. How then does Mill even attempt to avoid this contradiction? His chief argument seems to be that virtue, money, and other such objects, when they are thus desired in and for themselves, are desired only as a part of happiness. Now, what does this mean? Happiness, as we saw, has been defined by Mill as pleasure and the absence of pain. Does Mill mean to say that money, these actual coins, which he admits to be desired in and for themselves, are a part either of pleasure or of the absence of pain? Will he maintain that those coins themselves are in my mind and actually a part of my pleasant feelings? If this is to be said, all words are useless. Nothing can possibly be distinguished from anything else. If these two things are not distinct, what on earth is? We shall hear next that this table is really and truly the same thing as this room, that a cab horse is in fact indistinguishable from St. Paul's Cathedral, that this book of Mill's which I hold in my hand, because it was his pleasure to produce it, is now and at this moment a part of the happiness which he felt many years ago and which has so long ceased to be. Pray consider a moment what this contemptible nonsense really means. Money, says Mill, is only desirable as a means to happiness. Perhaps so, but what then? Why, says Mill, money is undoubtedly desired for its own sake. Yes, go on, say we. Well, says Mill, if money is desired for its own sake, it must be desirable as an end in itself. I have said so myself. Oh, say we, but you have also said just now that it was only desirable as a means. I own I did, says Mill, but I will try to patch up matters by saying that what is only a means to an end is the same thing as a part of that end. I dare say the public won't notice. And the public haven't noticed. Yet this is certainly what Mill has done. He has broken down the distinction between means and ends upon the precise observance of which his hedonism rests. And he has been compelled to do this because he failed to distinguish end in the sense of what is desirable from end in the sense of what is desired, a distinction which, nevertheless, both the present argument and his whole book presupposes. This is a consequence of the naturalistic fallacy. 44. Mill, then, has nothing better to say for himself than this. His two fundamental propositions are, in his own words, that to think of an object as desirable, unless for the sake of its consequences, and to think of it as pleasant, are one and the same thing, and that desire anything except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant is a physical and metaphysical impossibility. Both of these statements are, we have seen, merely supported by fallacies. The first seems to rest on the naturalistic fallacy, the second rests partly on this, partly on the fallacy of confusing ends and means, and partly on the fallacy of confusing a pleasant thought with the thought of a pleasure. His very language shews this. For that the idea of a thing is pleasant in his second clause is obviously meant to be the same fact which he denotes by thinking of it as pleasant in his first. Accordingly, Mill's argument for the proposition that pleasure is the sole good, and our refutation of those arguments, may be summed up as follows. First of all, he takes the desirable, which he uses as a synonym for the good, to mean what can be desired. The test, again, of what can be desired is, according to him, what actually is desired. If therefore, he says, we can find some one thing which is always and alone desired, that thing will necessarily be the only thing that is desirable, the only thing that is good as an end. In this argument the naturalistic fallacy is plainly involved. That fallacy, I explained, consists in the contention that good means nothing but some simple or complex notion that can be defined in terms of natural qualities. In Mill's case, good is thus supposed to mean simply what is desired, and what is desired is something which can thus be defined in natural terms. Mill tells us that we ought to desire something, an ethical proposition, because we actually do desire it. But if his contention that I ought to desire means nothing but I do desire were true, then he is only entitled to say, we do desire so and so because we do desire it. And that is not an ethical proposition at all, it is a mere tautology. The whole object of Mill's book is to help us to discover what we ought to do. But in fact, by attempting to define the meaning of this ought, he has completely debarred himself from ever fulfilling that object. He has confined himself to telling us what we do. Mill's first argument, then, is that, because good means desired, therefore the desired is good, but having thus arrived at an ethical conclusion, by denying that any ethical conclusion is possible, he still needs another argument to make his conclusion a basis for hedonism. He has to prove that we always do desire pleasure or freedom from pain, and that we never desire anything else whatever. This second doctrine, which Professor Sidgwick has called psychological hedonism, I accordingly discussed. I pointed out how obviously untrue it is that we never desire anything but pleasure, and how there is not a shadow of ground for saying even that, whenever we desire anything, we always desire pleasure as well as that thing. I attributed the obstinate belief in these untruths partly to a confusion between the cause of desire and the object of desire. It may, I said, be true that desire can never occur unless it be preceded by some actual pleasure. But even if this is true, it obviously gives no ground for saying that the object of desire is always some future pleasure. By the object of desire is meant that, of which the idea causes desire in us, it is some pleasure which we anticipate, some pleasure which we have not got, which is the object of desire, whenever we do desire pleasure. And any actual pleasure which may be excited by the idea of this anticipated pleasure is obviously not the same pleasure as that anticipated pleasure, of which only the idea is actual. This actual pleasure is not what we want. What we want is always something which we have not got. And to say that pleasure always causes us to want is quite a different thing from saying that what we want is always pleasure. Finally, we saw, Mill admits all this. He insists that we do actually desire other things than pleasure, and yet he says we do really desire nothing else. He tries to explain away this contradiction by confusing together two notions, which he has before carefully distinguished, the notions of means and of end. He now says that a means to an end is the same thing as part of that end. To this last fallacy special attention should be given, as our ultimate decision with regard to hedonism will largely turn upon it. 45. It is this ultimate decision with regard to hedonism at which we must now try to arrive. So far I have been only occupied with refuting Mill's naturalistic arguments for hedonism, but the doctrine that pleasure alone is desirable may still be true, although Mill's fallacies cannot prove it so. This is the question which we now have to face. This proposition, pleasure alone is good or desirable, belongs undoubtedly to that class of propositions to which Mill at first rightly pretended it belonged, the class of first principles which are not amendable to direct proof. But in this case, as he also rightly says, consideration may be presented capable of determining the intellect either to give or withhold its assent to the doctrine. It is such considerations that Professor Sidgwick presents, and such also that I shall try to present for the opposite view. This proposition that pleasure alone is good as an end The fundamental proposition of ethical hedonism will then appear in Professor Sidgwick's language as an object of intuition. I shall try to shew you why my intuition denies it, just as his intuition affirms it. It may always be true, notwithstanding neither intuition can prove whether it is true or not. I am bound to be satisfied if I can present considerations capable of determining the intellect to reject it. Now it may be said that this is a very unsatisfactory state of things. It is indeed, but it is important to make a distinction between two different reasons which may be given for calling it unsatisfactory. Is it unsatisfactory because our principle cannot be proved? Or is it unsatisfactory merely because we do not agree with one another about it? I am inclined to think that the latter is the chief reason, for the mere fact that in certain cases proof is impossible does not usually give us the least uneasiness. For instance, nobody can prove that there is a chair beside me. Yet I do not suppose that anyone is much dissatisfied for that reason. We all agree that it is a chair, and that is enough to content us, although it is quite possible we may be wrong. A madman, of course, might come in and say that it is not a chair but an elephant. We could not prove that he was wrong, and the fact that he did not agree with us might then begin to make us uneasy. Much more, then, shall we be uneasy if someone whom we do not think to be mad disagrees with us. We shall try to argue with him, and we shall probably be content if we lead him to agree with us, although we shall not have proved our point. We can only persuade him by shewing him that our view is consistent with something else which he holds to be true, whereas his original view is contradictory to it. But it will be impossible to prove that that something else, which we both agree to be true, is really so. We shall be satisfied to have settled the matter in dispute by means of it, merely because we are agreed on it. In short, our dissatisfaction in these cases is almost always of the type felt by the poor lunatic in the story. "I said the world was mad," says he, "and the world said I was mad, and, confounded, they outvoted me." It is, I say, almost always such a disagreement, and not the impossibility of proof, which makes us call the state of things unsatisfactory. For indeed, who can prove that proof itself is a warrant of truth? We are all agreed that the laws of logic are true, and therefore we accept a result which is proved by their means. But such a proof is satisfactory to us only because we are all so fully agreed that it is a warrant of truth. And yet we cannot, by the nature of the case, prove that we are right in being so agreed. Accordingly, I do not think we need be much distressed by our admission that we cannot prove whether pleasure alone is good or not. We may be able to arrive at an agreement notwithstanding, and if so, I think it will be satisfactory. And yet I am not very sanguine about our prospects of such satisfaction. Ethics, and philosophy in general, have always been in a peculiarly unsatisfactory state. There has been no agreement about them, as there is about the existence of chairs and lights and benches. I should therefore be a fool if I hoped to settle one great point of controversy, now and once for all. It is extremely improbable I shall convince. It would be highly presumptuous even to hope that in the end, say 2 or 3 centuries hence, it will be agreed that pleasure is not the sole good. Philosophical questions are so difficult, the problems they raise are so complex, that no one can fairly expect, now any more than in the past, to win more than a very limited assent. And yet I confess that the considerations which I am about to present appear to me to be absolutely convincing. I do think that they ought to convince, if only I can put them well. In any case, I can but try. I shall try now to put an end to that unsatisfactory state of things of which I have been speaking. I shall try to produce an agreement that the fundamental principle of hedonism is very like an absurdity, by shewing what it must mean, if it is clearly thought out, and how that clear meaning is in conflict with other beliefs, which will, I hope, not be so easily given up. 46. Well, then, we now proceed to discuss intuitionistic hedonism, and the beginning of this discussion marks, it is to be observed, a turning point in my ethical method. The point I have been laboring hitherto, the point that good is indefinable, and that to deny this involves a fallacy, is a point capable of strict proof, for to deny it involves contradictions. But now we are coming to the question, for the sake of answering which ethics exists, the question what things or qualities are good. Of any answer to this question no direct proof is possible, and that, just because of our former answer as to the meaning of good, direct proof was possible. We are now confined to the hope of what Mill calls indirect proof, the hope of determining one another's intellect. And we are now so confined just because in the matter of the former question we are not so confined. Here, then, is an intuition to be submitted to our verdict. The intuition that pleasure alone is good as an end, good in and for itself. 47. Well, in this connection it seems first desirable to touch on another doctrine of Mill's, another doctrine which, in the interest of hedonism, Professor Sidgwick has done very wisely to reject. This is the doctrine of difference of quality in pleasures. If I am asked, says Mill, what I mean by difference of quality in pleasure, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both have a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison a small amount. Now it is well known that Bentham rested his case for hedonism on quantity of pleasure alone. It was his maxim that quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry, and Mill apparently considers Bentham to have proved that nevertheless poetry is better than pushpin, that poetry does produce a greater quantity of pleasure. But yet, says Mill, the utilitarians might have taken the other and, as it may be called, higher ground with entire consistency. Now we see from this that Mills acknowledges quality of pleasure to be another or different ground for estimating pleasures than Bentham's quantity, and moreover by that question begging higher, which he afterwards translates into superior, he seems to betray an uncomfortable feeling that, after all, if you take quantity of pleasure for your only standard, something may be wrong and you may be deserved to be called a pig. And it may presently appear that you very likely would deserve this name. But meanwhile I only wish to shew that Mill's admissions as to the quality of pleasure are either inconsistent with his hedonism, or else afford no other ground for it than would be given by mere quantity of pleasure. It will be seen that Mill's test for one's pleasure's superiority in quality over another is the preference of most people who have experienced both. A pleasure so preferred, he holds, is more desirable. But then, as we have seen, he holds that to think of an object as desirable and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing. He holds, therefore, that the preference of experts merely proves that one pleasure is pleasanter than another. But if that is so, how can he distinguish this standard from the standard of quantity of pleasure? Can one pleasure be pleasanter than another, except in the sense that it gives more pleasure? Pleasant must, if words are to have any meaning at all, denote some one quality common to all things that are pleasant, and, if so, then one thing can only be more pleasant than another, according as it has more or less of this one quality. But then let us try the other alternative, and suppose that Mill does not seriously mean that this pleasure of experts merely proves one pleasure to be pleasanter than another. Well, in this case, what does preferred mean? It cannot mean more desired, since, as we know, the degree of desire is always, according to Mill, in exact proportion to the degree of pleasantness. But in that case the basis of Mill's hedonism collapses, for he is admitting that one thing may be preferred over another, and thus proved more desirable, although it is not more desired. In this case Mill's judgment of preference is just a judgment of that intuitional kind which I have been contending to be necessary to establish the hedonistic or any other principle. It is a direct judgment that one thing is more desirable or better than another, a judgment utterly independent of all considerations as to whether one thing is more desired or pleasanter than another. This is to admit that good is good and indefinable. 48. And note another point that is brought out by this discussion. Mill's judgment of preference, so far from establishing the principle that pleasure alone is good, is obviously inconsistent with it. He admits that experts can judge whether one pleasure is more desirable than another because pleasures differ in quality. But what does this mean? If one pleasure can differ from another in quality, that means that a pleasure is something complex, something composed, in fact a pleasure in addition to that which produces pleasure. For instance, Mill speaks of sensual indulgences as lower pleasures. But what is a sensual indulgence? It is surely a certain excitement of some sense together with the pleasure caused by such excitement. Mill, therefore, in admitting that a sensual indulgence can be directly judged to be lower than another pleasure, in which the degree of pleasure involved may be the same, is admitting that other things may be good or bad quite independently of the pleasure which accompanies them. A pleasure is, in fact, merely a misleading term which conceals the fact that what we are dealing with is not pleasure but something else, which may indeed necessarily produce pleasure, but is nevertheless quite distinct from it. Mill, therefore, in thinking that to estimate quality of pleasure is quite consistent with his hedonistic principle that pleasure and absence of pain alone are desirable as ends, has again committed the fallacy of confusing ends and means. For take even the most favourable supposition of his meaning. Let us suppose that by a pleasure he does not mean, as his words imply, that which produces pleasure and the pleasure produced. Let us suppose him to mean that there are various kinds of pleasure, in the sense in which there are various kinds of colour, blue, red, green, etc. Even in this case, if we are to say that our end is colour alone, then although it is impossible we should have colour without having some particular colour, yet the particular colour we must have is only a means to our having colour, if colour is really our end. And if colour is our only possible end, as Mill says pleasure is, then there can be no possible reason for preferring one colour to another, red, for instance, to blue, except that the one is more of a colour than the other. Yet the opposite of this is what Mill is attempting to hold with regard to pleasures. Accordingly, a consideration of Mill's view that some pleasures are superior to others in quality brings out one point which may help to determine the intellect. With regard to the intuition, pleasure is the only good. For it brings out the fact that if you say pleasure, you must mean pleasure. You must mean some one thing common to all different pleasures, some one thing which may exist in different degrees but which cannot differ in kind. I have pointed out that if you say, as Mill does, that quality of pleasure is to be taken into account, then you are no longer holding that pleasure alone is good as an end, since you imply that something else, something which is not present in all pleasure, is also good as an end. The illustration I have given from colour expresses this point in its most acute form. It is plain that if you say, colour alone is good as an end, then you can give no possible reason for preferring one colour to another. Your only standard of good and bad will then be colour, and since red and blue both conform equally to this, the only standard, you can have no other whereby to judge whether red is better than blue. It is true that you cannot have color unless you also have one or all of the particular colors. They, therefore, if color is the end, will all be good as means, but none of them can be better than another even as a means. Far less can any one of them be regarded as an end in itself. Just so with pleasure. If we do really mean pleasure alone is good as an end, then we must agree with Bentham that quantity of pleasure being equal, Pushpin is as good as poetry. To have thus dismissed Mill's reference to quality of pleasure is therefore to have made one step in the desired direction. The reader will now no longer be prevented from agreeing with me by any idea that the hedonistic principle, pleasure alone is good as an end, is consistent with the view that one pleasure may be of a better quality than another. These two views, we have seen, are contradictory to one another. We must choose between them, and if we choose the latter, then we must give up the principle of hedonism. 49. But as I said, Professor Sidgwick has seen that they are inconsistent. He has seen that he must choose between them. He has chosen. He has rejected the test by quality of pleasure, and has accepted the hedonistic principle. He still maintains that pleasure alone is good as an end. I propose, therefore, to discuss the considerations which he has offered in order to convince us. I shall hope that discussion to remove some more of such prejudices and misunderstandings as might prevent agreement with me. If I can shew that some of the considerations which Professor Sidgwick urges are such as we need by no means agree with, and that others are actually rather in my favour rather than in his, we may have again advanced a few steps nearer to the unanimity which we desire. 50. The passages in the Methods of Ethics to which I shall now invite attention are to be found in Book 1, Chapter 9, Section 4, and in Book 3, Chapter 14, Section 4 to 5. The first of these two passages runs as follows. I think if we consider carefully such permanent results as are commonly judged to be good, other than qualities of human beings, we can find nothing that, on reflection, appears to possess this quality of goodness out of relation to human existence, or at least to some consciousness or feeling. For example, we commonly judge some inanimate objects, scenes, etc., to be good as possessing beauty, and others bad from ugliness. Still no one would consider it rational to aim at the production of beauty in external nature, apart from any possible contemplation of it by human beings. In fact, when beauty is maintained to be objective, it is not commonly meant that it exists as beauty out of relation to any mind whatsoever, but only that there is some standard of beauty valid for all minds. It may, however, be said that beauty and other results commonly judged to be good, though we do not conceive them to exist out of relation to human beings, or at least minds of some kind, are yet so far separable as ends from the human beings on whom their existence depends, that their realization may conceivably come into competition with the perfection or happiness of these beings. Thus, though beautiful things cannot be thought worth producing except as possible objects of contemplation, still a man may devote himself to their production without any consideration of the persons who are to contemplate them. Similarly, knowledge is a good which cannot exist except in minds, and yet one may be more interested in the development of knowledge than in its possession by any particular minds, and may take the former as an ultimate end without regarding the latter. Still, as soon as the alternatives are clearly apprehended, it will, I think, be generally held that beauty, knowledge, and other ideal goods, as well as all external material things, are only reasonably to be sought by men in so far as they conduce either 1. To happiness, or 2. To the perfection or excellence of human existence. I say human, for though most utilitarians consider the pleasure and freedom from pain of the inferior animals to be included in the happiness which they take as the right and proper end of conduct, no one seems to contend that we ought to aim at perfecting brutes, except as a means to our ends, or at least as objects of scientific or aesthetic contemplation for us. Nor again can we include as a practical end the existence of beings above the human. We certainly apply the idea of good to the divine existence, just as we do to his work, and indeed in a preeminent manner, and when it is said that we should do all things to the glory of God, it may seem to be implied that the existence of God is made better by our glorifying him. Still this inference, when explicitly drawn, appears somewhat impious, and theologians generally recoil from it, and refrain from using the notion of a possible addition to the goodness of the divine existence as a ground of human duty. Nor can the influence of our actions on other extra-human intelligences beside the divine be at present made matter of scientific discussion. I shall therefore confidently lay down that if there be any good other than happiness to be sought by man as an ultimate practical end, it can only be the goodness, perfection, or excellence of human existence. How far this notion includes more than virtue, what its precise relation to pleasure is, and to what method we shall be logically led if we accept it as fundamental, are questions which we shall more conveniently discuss after the detailed examination of these two other notions, pleasure and virtue, in which we shall be engaged in the 2 following books. It will be observed that in this passage Professor Sidgwick tries to limit the range of objects among which the ultimate end may be found. He does not say what that end is, but he does exclude from it everything but certain characters of human existence, and the possible ends which he thus excludes do not again come up for consideration. They are put out of court once and for all by this passage and by this passage alone. Now, is this exclusion justified? I cannot think it is. No one, says Professor Sidgwick, would consider it rational to aim at the production of beauty in external nature apart from any possible contemplation of it by human beings. Well, I may say at once that I, for one, do consider this rational, and let us see if I cannot get any one to agree with me. Consider what this admission really means. It entitles us to put the following case. Let us imagine one world exceedingly beautiful. Imagine it as beautiful as you can. Put into it whatever on this earth you most admire, mountains, rivers, the sea, trees and sunset, stars and moon. Imagine these all combined in the most exquisite proportions, that no one thing jars against another, but each contributes to the beauty of the whole. And then imagine the ugliest world you can possibly conceive. Imagine it simply one heap of filth, containing everything that is most disgusting to us, for whatever reason, and the whole, as far as may be, without one redeeming feature. Such a pair of worlds we are entitled to compare. They fall within Professor Sidgwick's meaning, and the comparison is highly relevant to it. The only thing we are not entitled to imagine is that any human being ever has, or ever, by any possibility can, live in either, can ever see and enjoy the beauty of the one or hate the foulness of the other. Well, even so, supposing them quite apart from any possible contemplation by human beings, still, is it irrational to hold that it is better that the beautiful world should exist than the one which is ugly? Would it not be well, in any case, to do what we could to produce it rather than the other? Certainly I cannot help thinking that it would, and I hope that some may agree with me in this extreme instance. The instance is extreme. It is highly improbable, not to say impossible, we should ever have such a choice before us. In any actual choice we should have to consider the possible effects of our action upon conscious beings, and among these possible effects there are always some, I think, which ought to be preferred to the existence of mere beauty. But this only means that in our present state, in which but a very small portion of the good is attainable, the pursuit of beauty for its own sake must always be postponed to the pursuit of some greater good, which is equally attainable. But it is enough for my purpose, if it be admitted that, supposing no greater good were at all attainable, then beauty must in itself be regarded as a greater good than ugliness. If it be admitted that, in that case, we should not be left without any reason for preferring one course of action to another, we should not be left without any duty whatever, but that it would then be our positive duty to make the world more beautiful so far as we were able, since nothing better than beauty could then result from our efforts. If this be once admitted, if in any imaginable case you do admit that the existence of a more beautiful thing is better in itself than that of one more ugly, quite apart from its effect on any human feeling, then Professor Sidgwick's principle has broken down. Then we shall have to include in our ultimate end something beyond the limits of human existence. I admit, of course, that our beautiful world would be better still, if there were human beings in it to contemplate and enjoy its beauty. But that admission makes nothing against my point. If it be once admitted that the beautiful world in itself is better than the ugly, then it follows that however many beings may enjoy it, and however much better their enjoyment may be than it is itself, yet its mere existence adds something to the goodness of the whole. It is not only a means to our end, but also itself a part thereof. End of chapter 3, part 2.